I don't consider myself a man of possessions, but I've always been a man of passions. My only one, the one that remained after a life of silent losses, was for antiques. Not the expensive, polished museum pieces, but the ones that had a story, that seemed to have absorbed the lives of their former owners. In an old piece of furniture, in a faded frame, I could see time, love, the pain of a family. And that's what I was looking for. Pieces of a past that seemed more alive than my own present. My name is Pedro. I am 50 years old, but I feel as if I have lived triple that. The wrinkles around my eyes and the white beard that covered my face were a map of my days. The antique shop I owned was small, nestled on a narrow, forgotten street, with the smell of old wood, dust, and wax. It was my refuge, my sanctuary. It was there that I would get lost for hours, cleaning, restoring, imagining. I spent most of my time alone, but I never felt lonely. Every piece I acquired was a silent companion, an echo of a life that was gone. My friends, few and far between, always said I was a lone wolf. Maybe I was. But the truth is, I was just a man who had fallen in love with ghosts. Not the ones from legends, but the ones from memory. And it was in search of a new piece of memory that I went to that auction. It wasn't an elite auction, but a small event in a country house an hour from the city, with items from an old mansion that was being demolished. Most of the pieces were trivial, but there was one detail on the list that caught my eye. Wall mirror, carved frame, 19th century. The description was vague, but the photo, small and grainy, hypnotized me. The carving of the frame seemed so intricate, so delicate, as if it had been made by a craftsman who had more than just talent in his hands. There was a story there. I could feel it.
I arrived early. The house was gloomy and stuffy, with a smell of mold and death, as if the very structure was in a state of decay. The air was heavy, dense. The piece was in the corner, covered by a dirty cloth. I approached, my heart racing, the adrenaline of the hunt. The fabric was thick and old, and when I pulled it back, a cloud of dust rose, making me cough. And then I saw it. The mirror was larger than I expected. The frame, of dark and heavy wood, was a work of art, carved with grotesque details, faces of weeping angels, gargoyles with mouths open in a silent scream, twisted vines that intertwined like serpents. The carving was so deep that shadows accumulated in the cavities, giving the impression that the figures were moving. The colors, once vibrant, had become dark, almost black with time. But what caught my attention the most was the glass. It was not ordinary glass. It was old, with small imperfections that made the image look slightly distorted, as if I were looking at myself through dirty water. The surface was strangely dark, an opaque reflection that seemed to swallow the light instead of reflecting it. And even in the gloom of the warehouse, the surface seemed to have a light of its own, an inner glow. It was hypnotic. I felt a shiver run through me. It was not a shiver of fear, but a shiver of discovery. It was as if the piece was calling me, drawing me in. The gargoyles on the frame seemed to stare at me, their empty eyes filled with a secret that only I could see. A voice, muffled and inaudible, seemed to come from the mirror, inviting me to look closer. I bought it, not for a high price, but for a value that made me feel victorious. The people at the auction seemed strange, looking at the mirror with a mixture of revulsion and fear. No one wanted the piece. For them, it was just an old, ugly item. But for me, it was a treasure.
I arranged for it to be transported to my shop. The mirror was heavy, and the two men who helped me put it in the truck complained about the weight and difficulty. As they secured it, I saw one of them look at the surface. He got scared, backed away. "What a strange mirror, sir. It seems it doesn't reflect properly. My image looked distorted." I smiled, adjusting the cloth over it. "It's an old piece, son, the patina of time. It's part of the charm." He didn't seem convinced, but he fell silent. That night, the mirror stayed covered in the truck. I couldn't sleep. Its image repeated in my mind. The weeping angels, the gargoyles staring at me. It was a macabre work of art, and I could hardly wait to have it in my shop, where I could appreciate it, clean it, admire its details. It was as if I had found the holy grail of antiques. The next day, with the help of a neighbor, I installed it in my shop. It was an arduous job. The piece was too heavy and needed a reinforced support to hold it. I positioned it on the back wall, where it could be the focal point of my small sanctuary. The faint light that came through the front window seemed to be sucked in by the dark glass. The mirror didn't reflect the shop. It didn't reflect the furniture. It reflected only an opaque darkness with a glow in the center that looked like a cat's eye. I spent the whole day in front of it, cleaning the frame, waxing it to make the dark wood shine. Each carving, each detail, each twisted vine, I got lost in its grotesque beauty. My fingers traced the angels, the gargoyles. I felt an energy coming from the piece, a cold heat, a vibration that made me feel alive. But what fascinated me the most was the glass. I ran a soft cloth over it and felt a strange resistance, as if the mirror refused to be cleaned. The surface didn't get clearer, only darker. At one point, I caught myself looking at my own reflection. It was there, but slightly distorted, as if I were looking at myself through murky water. My face looked paler, my eyes deeper. But what gave me a shiver was what I saw in the corner of my vision, a shadow, a dark blur that moved behind me in the reflection. I turned abruptly, but the shop was empty. I was alone. I laughed to myself, shaking my head. The fatigue, the obsession with the new piece, was playing tricks on me. The sun had already set, and the shop was immersed in the gloom. The mirror was the only thing that seemed to have a light of its own, a strange glow that illuminated the room. The frame seemed darker, more menacing, with shadows dancing in the cavities, giving the impression that the gargoyles were staring at me. That night, the shop was closed, and I retreated to my small apartment in the back. But sleep didn't come. The image of the mirror repeated in my mind. The angels, the gargoyles, the dark glass, the blur that moved in the reflection.
I felt strangely restless, as if I was forgetting something important. The next day, I returned to the shop with the same passion, but something was different. The air was colder, denser. The smell of mold and wax had been replaced by a smell of wet earth and something else, metallic. The mirror was there, in the same place, but it seemed to have become darker, more menacing. The eyes of the gargoyles, empty, seemed to follow me, and the blur, it was there again, in the reflection. I approached the mirror with a strange feeling of vertigo. I looked directly at it, at my distorted reflection. My image was paler than the day before, with deeper, emptier eyes. I turned, I moved, but the reflection didn't seem to follow me perfectly. There was a delay, a time lapse. For a split second, I moved, and my reflection remained still, watching me. And then it followed me with a subtle but noticeable delay. I blinked, and the reflection blinked after me. The shiver that ran through me was not of discovery, but of terror. A cold terror that chilled my blood. I moved away from the mirror, stumbling over a crate. My breathing became ragged. What was that? What the hell was that? I tried to calm myself, to convince myself that it was just my mind, the fatigue. I was sleep-deprived, obsessing over the new piece. It was normal. Physics, logic, reason. I was a man of reason. There was nothing supernatural there, but the image of my reflection watching me, still, before following me, was etched in my mind, a rusty nail in a rotten board. I started to avoid the mirror. I covered it with a heavy sheet, but the feeling that it was there, watching me, wouldn't go away. I felt its presence in the shop, a weight, a cold that didn't come from the air conditioning. I could feel the empty eyes of the gargoyles staring at me through the fabric. In a moment of desperation, I decided to get rid of the piece. I had bought it, but what I felt was no longer passion. It was dread. I needed to get rid of it. But the mirror was too big, too heavy for me to move alone. I needed help. I called my neighbor, the same one who helped me put it in the shop. He agreed to come. He arrived the next day in the late afternoon. A tall, strong man, but with an air of fatigue. He looked at me strangely. "Pedro, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. And what's that smell? It smells like something's dying in here." I ignored him and guided him to the covered mirror. "I need you to help me get this out of here. I've changed my mind." He nodded. He helped me move some furniture to make space. When he pulled the sheet off, his expression on his face changed. He looked pale. "Damn, Pedro, what an ugly mirror. It looks like something from a horror movie." I ignored him and guided him to the side of the mirror. He hesitated. He looked at himself in the mirror, and the expression of dread on his face gave me a shiver. He backed away, shaking his head. "No, I can't. I'm sorry, Pedro. There's something wrong with this piece. I felt sick just looking at it. My image, it looked angry at me."
I tried to calm him down, convince him, but he was scared. "Look, I have to go, Pedro. I'm not feeling well." He left, leaving me alone. I was in a panic. I couldn't get rid of the piece. I was trapped. I was alone with my curse. I spent the night in the shop. Sleep didn't come. The mirror's light seemed to intensify. The smell of wet earth and metal became unbearable. I huddled in a corner, trying to ignore the piece. I heard whispers coming from inside the mirror, unintelligible words, a muffled voice that seemed to call me. I covered my ears with my hands, but the sounds seemed to come from inside my own head. And then the blur, not just in the corner of my vision, but in the center of the mirror. A slender, dark figure with empty eyes that moved in the reflection as if it were trying to get out. The frame seemed to tremble, and the carved gargoyles seemed to smile, their sharp teeth showing. The figure moved back into the darkness of the glass, and then one of its arms extended like a dry branch and touched the surface of the mirror as if it were testing the barrier. I screamed, a high-pitched scream of pure terror. I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what was happening. I only knew I was in danger. The next day, when the sun was already high, I got up, exhausted, with my eyes red from fear and sleep deprivation. The shop was silent, with the smell of wood and dust. The mirror was there, in the same place. The figure was gone, but the feeling of dread wasn't. I decided I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell that piece was. And that's how I started to research. Old auctions, antique shops, sales records. I spent days, weeks in libraries, on online forums, trying to find any mention of the mirror. And I found it.
The piece had a name. The Soul Mirror. And a story. A macabre story. Of a family that had been cursed by the piece. The family that owned it had been found dead, with soulless bodies. Their eyes were empty, their bodies pale, as if they had been drained of life. The deaths were attributed to a mysterious illness, but one of the family members, before dying, left a diary. He recounted the presence of an entity that lived in the mirror, that fed on the souls of those who looked at it for too long. The entity didn't kill, it just consumed, devoured the person's essence, leaving behind an empty body. The diary described the symptoms, the feeling of being watched, the distorted reflection, the blurs, the whispers, the figure that tried to get out of the mirror, the gargoyles that moved, everything I had experienced. The story was real, and I had been the next one to be cursed. The last entry in the diary was a warning. Don't look at the mirror. Don't look at your reflection. Don't look into the eyes of the entity. It's there, waiting to feed. And when it gets out, it won't get out alone. It will drag your soul with it. The diary ended there, without a conclusion, without a solution. The last entry was just an ink smudge, as if the author had been interrupted by the entity, interrupted by the mirror. I moved away from the computer, my body trembling. The information fit perfectly. The mirror was not just an antique item, it was a portal. And I, with my passion for antiques, had opened that portal, and the entity, the creature, had noticed me. I went back to the shop with the certainty that my life was over. The piece was there, covered, but the feeling of its presence was overwhelming. The smell of wet earth and metal became unbearable. I huddled in a corner, trying to ignore the piece. What could I do? I couldn't get rid of it. And if I looked at it, I would be lost. I was trapped. I was alone with my curse, with the certainty that my soul would be the next to be sucked out. From that moment on, my life became a hell of paranoia and sleep deprivation. I spent the day in the shop, but I dared not to look at the mirror, not even at the sheet that covered it. I felt its presence, a weight, a cold that consumed me. I heard whispers, muffled laughter coming from the mirror. I saw blurs, shadows that moved in the corner of my vision. I felt the empty eyes of the gargoyles staring at me. And at night, when the shop was closed, the nightmare became real. The entity, the faceless man, would come out of the mirror. I didn't see it with my eyes, but I felt it. I felt its presence in my apartment. I felt its cold breath on my neck, its icy fingers running over my body. I heard the whispers, now in my own mind, calling me, inviting me to look at the mirror, to join them. Fear consumed me, gnawed at me from within. I could no longer eat, could no longer sleep. I was losing weight. My face was becoming paler and paler, my eyes deeper and deeper. I was becoming the shadow itself. I was dying. And the mirror, the entity, the creature was watching me, feeding on my fear, on my soul that was draining away with every second.
The only solution, the only hope, was to get rid of the piece. But how? I couldn't destroy it. I couldn't sell it. And if I did, I would be condemning another person to this same hell. And I wasn't that kind of man. I needed to find a way to seal the portal, to trap the entity. But how? The answer, as macabre as it was in the diary. The entity fed. It needed souls. And I, as terrifying as the idea was to me, had a mirror. And the entity, in my shop, was hungry. I needed to think, to act. But what could I do? The mirror entity, the faceless man, the creature from the 19th century, was haunting me. And I, no matter how much I tried to run, no matter how much I hid, was trapped. I was alone, with the certainty that my soul would be the next to be sucked out, to be consumed, and that my body would just be another of the many lifeless bodies that the mirror had left behind. I was on the verge of the abyss, and the entity, in my mirror, was calling me, and I, no matter how much I tried to resist, was getting closer and closer to answering the call. The certainty that my life was over didn't come as a shock, but as a tired sigh, a cold resignation that settled in the marrow of my bones, deeper than fear. I was no longer scared in the conventional sense of the word. Terror had become my routine, the air I breathed, the monotonous beat of my heart. The diary, with its trembling words and the last ink smudge, didn't scare me. It gave me a manual of how my death would be, and my body, which was once a home for my soul, was now just a waiting room, a vessel waiting to be emptied.
The days became a blur, an endless repetition of paranoia and deprivation. I covered the mirror, but the sheet wasn't a barrier. It was just a translucent veil. I felt the empty eyes of the gargoyles piercing me, the opaque glow of the glass projecting into my mind, even with my eyes closed. The smell of wet earth and metal, which at first was subtle, became the fragrance of my shop. I got used to it, just as I got used to the low, constant hum that seemed to come from the wood of the frame, a vibration that aligned with the pulse of my own blood. The whispers no longer came from outside. They echoed inside my head, indistinct words, as if someone were speaking through a thick wall. But the message was clear. Look at me. Look in the mirror. Come here. They were whispers of invitation, whispers of temptation. The creature, the entity, the faceless man was playing with me, testing me. And with every second I resisted, with every beat of my heart, I could feel its hunger, its impatience. The shop became my prison, the apartment in the back, my dungeon. I didn't go out. I didn't answer the phone. The outside world became a distant echo, a faded memory of a life that no longer belonged to me. My few savings allowed me to buy enough food to survive, but the entity's hunger was the only one that mattered. I was thin, pale, with deep reddish eyes, a reflection of the ghost I had become. My image in the bathroom mirror, the only one I still dared to look at, was a grotesque caricature of the man I used to be. My hair was disheveled, my beard white and dirty. I looked like a madman, and maybe I was.
Paranoia was my new name. I would find myself looking at shadows, at the dark corners of the shop, waiting to see something. The blur I saw in the corner of my vision was no longer a blur. It was a slender, tall shape that moved slowly, as if it were testing the invisible barrier I had built around myself. Sometimes I swore I saw the sheet covering the mirror move, a subtle tremor, a cold breath of air that came from inside the fabric, a breath that was not mine. One night, I woke to a noise. It wasn't a loud noise, but the dry sound of something falling.
My breath caught in my throat. I was in my apartment, but the sound had seemed to come from the shop. I got up, my heart pounding with the force of a drum. The gargoyles, the angels, the mirror. I was scared, but curiosity, madness called me. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam of light trembling in my shaky hands. The air in the shop was cold, the smell unbearable. The light from my flashlight danced on the furniture, on the frames, on the objects that were once my passion, and now were just silent witnesses to my ruin. The sheet that covered the mirror was there, in the same place. The noise, I realized, had come from a small table with a porcelain trinket. The object was on the floor, shattered into hundreds of pieces. It had been thrown, I could swear. How? There was no one in the shop. I was alone. But the most terrifying part of that night was not the broken trinket. It was what I saw on the surface of the mirror through the thin sheet. The shadows of the gargoyles and carved angels seemed to dance, to move, to distort, and for a second, a tall, thin silhouette in the shape of a man was projected in the faint light that came through the window. A shadow that was not mine. I moved away, backing up slowly, my heart beating so hard that I could feel the arteries in my neck pulse. I went back to my apartment, huddled in my bed, and cried. I cried not from fear, but from exhaustion. I had no more tears. I was empty. The entity, the faceless man, was torturing me, killing me slowly.
The solution from the diary haunted me like a profane prayer. The entity fed on souls. It needed souls. And I, as terrifying as the idea was to me, had a mirror, and the entity in my shop was hungry. The diary didn't talk about how to seal the portal, only about how the creature fed, and I knew, with a cold certainty, that my soul, already half consumed, would not be enough. I started to think about strategies in a disordered way, a web of chaotic thoughts. I needed a soul. But I was not a murderer. I was not a monster. And what would I do? Would I lure someone to the shop so the entity could feed on their soul? Would I become a monster to get rid of another? The idea was so heinous that it made me nauseous. I refused to consider it. I am a man of principles, I told myself. But the entity's voice in my head, now clearer, more defined, seemed to laugh at my dilemma. It knew I was at my limit. It knew that my morality was just a thin shell, about to be broken by despair. I remembered an ancient legend of a town that, to protect itself from a creature that fed on souls, offered it the blood of animals. I clung to that idea like a castaway clinging to a piece of wood. It was a macabre idea, but not as horrendous as sacrificing a human being. I needed blood. I needed an offering. That night, I left my shop for the first time in weeks. The outside world seemed strange, the lights of the cars, the sounds of the city. Everything seemed distant, unreal. I walked through the streets, a shadow among shadows, in search of a victim, but not a human victim. I needed an animal, a cat, a dog, a rat, something I could sacrifice to the entity so it would leave me in peace.
My mind, already tortured, was self-destructing. I was a man who, in search of a solution, was turning into something I didn't recognize. I felt dirty, impure. My passion for antiques, for a living past, had led me to a future of pure terror and self-destruction. I found a cat, a stray cat, thin, with dirty fur and green eyes glowing in the darkness. It looked at me, and I swore I saw fear in its eyes, as if it knew what I was about to do. My body, my mind, fought against the idea, but despair, the fear of the entity, pushed me forward. I had to do this. I had to get rid of that hell. I picked it up with a trembling hand and brought it back to my shop, to my prison, to my hell. The cat, now inside the shop, got scared. It meowed, struggled in my arms, and I put it on the floor. It ran to the corner, huddled, staring at me with green eyes glowing in the gloom. The smell of wet earth and metal seemed to have intensified. The mirror's hum became a low, constant roar. I approached the mirror, the sheet still covering it. The cat in the corner let out a hiss, and I could swear its fur stood on end. I was scared, but the entity's voice in my head, the muffled laughter, pushed me forward. I had to do this. I had to get rid of that hell. I grabbed a knife, one of my restoration tools. The blade, once used for carving, would now be used to kill. I approached the cat, but the animal moved away, staring at me with a fear that broke my heart. I couldn't. My morality, as fragile as it was, still existed. I was not a murderer. The cat, seeing my hesitation, ran away, and I let it go. It went out the back door, and I saw it run into the darkness of the street, to the freedom I had lost. I was on my knees, crying, the knife in my hand. I had failed. I was not strong enough to save myself. I was a victim, a piece of meat, ready to be consumed.
But then I saw it in the mirror. The sheet, which was once still, moved. Not a tremor, but an abrupt movement. A form, a silhouette was projected on the surface. The entity, the faceless man, was there, and it was not laughing. It was angry. The mirror's hum became a high-pitched scream, and the voice in my head, which was once a voice of temptation, became a roar. I got up, my heart pounding with the force of a drum. The entity, the creature, it was angry. The blood, the offering, it wanted blood, and I hadn't given it to it. I had failed to save myself, and now it would make me pay. I was trapped. I was alone, and my soul now was not the only one in danger. What I did next, I don't know if it was sanity or insanity. I turned and looked at the mirror. I looked directly at it. The sheet now became transparent, and I saw my reflection, my face, thin, pale, with deep eyes, staring at me. But behind me, in the reflection, the creature was there, and it was no longer a silhouette. It was a defined shape, the shape of a man, tall and slender, with empty eyes, with its mouth open in a horrendous smile. And it moved forward towards my reflection, and I, for a split second, saw myself with my hands outstretched, trying to hold myself back. and then my reflection merged with its, and I saw myself in the mirror with empty eyes. I screamed, a scream that came from my soul, a scream of pure terror. I backed away, stumbled, and fell to the floor. My breathing was ragged, my heart beating uncontrollably. I looked at the mirror. The creature was gone. The sheet was still, but I could swear that the air, once cold, was now warm, and the smell of wet earth and metal now had a touch of blood. The entity, the creature, had touched me. It had marked me, and I knew with a cold certainty that my time was up.
What happened after I looked in the mirror was a collapse, not of my shop, not the world around me, but of myself. My mind became a battlefield, and I, an exhausted soldier, out of ammunition. What I saw in the reflection, the grotesque fusion of my face with the creature's, was not a hallucination. It was a mark, a profane fingerprint. I felt dirty, contaminated, as if the entity had touched me and left behind a part of itself, a parasite that now fed from the inside out. The smell of wet earth and metal was no longer just an odor, it was the air I breathed. The bitter taste in my mouth, the weight on my chest, the constant feeling of being cold, even if the temperature was mild. It was its presence. The entity, the faceless man, was now in me. And it was no longer watching me. It was draining me. With every breath, I felt my essence drain away. With every beat of my heart, I felt a piece of my soul being sucked out. I became a ghost in my own life. I walked through the shop like a sleepwalker, with glazed eyes, my body trembling. I was no longer hungry, no longer sleepy. I felt nothing except fear. Fear no longer came in waves, but was a constant tide, an ocean of dread that swallowed me. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't obey me. I was paralyzed by terror, a prisoner in my own skin. The entity now communicated with me differently. It was no longer whispers, but thoughts. Not in my voice, but in its. A dry, emotionless voice, like the sound of dry leaves being trampled. It showed me images, not beautiful images of happy memories, but images of myself, of my childhood, of my family, distorted, dark. I saw my father, but he had empty eyes, like mine. I saw my mother, but her mouth was open in a silent scream, soundless. I saw my life, but it seemed to have been drained of color, of life. It was showing me what it was doing to me, showing me my death in slow motion. The mirror, in turn, became a black hole. The sheet that covered it seemed to have fused with it, becoming a second dark skin. But the glow, the cat's eye, the opaque glow that seemed to swallow the light was there, more intense than ever. The frame seemed to have become more grotesque. The gargoyles seemed to have moved, their teeth sharper, their eyes emptier. The angels who once wept now seemed to laugh, a malicious and cruel smile that terrified me. I remembered an ancient legend of a town
that, to protect itself from a creature that fed on souls, offered it the blood of animals. The cat, my failed attempt to offer a life to the entity, became a recurring nightmare. I saw myself in my mind, with the knife in my hand, approaching the animal, and the creature behind me, laughing at my weakness. The entity fed on my fear, on my guilt, on my weakness, and I, no matter how much I tried, couldn't stop feeling. Fear consumed me, gnawed at me from within. I no longer had control over my emotions, over my thoughts. I was a puppet in the hands of the creature, and it manipulated me, tortured me, killed me slowly. I remembered the diary, the last entry. Don't look in the mirror. Don't look at your reflection. Don't look into the eyes of the entity. It's there, waiting to feed. And when it gets out, it won't get out alone. It will drag your soul with it. The last entry was an ink smudge, as if the author had been interrupted by the entity, interrupted by the mirror. I became the last entry in the diary. My life became a period, an ink smudge waiting to be erased. I was on the verge of the abyss, and the entity in my mirror was calling me. And I, no matter how much I tried to resist, was getting closer and closer to answering the call.
I refuse to die. I refuse to be just another of the many empty bodies that the mirror had left behind. I needed a solution. I needed a way to seal the portal, to trap the entity. I started eating again, but not to nourish myself, to have energy. I started sleeping again, but not to rest, but to be alert, to have a clear mind. I needed to fight. Fight against my own fear, against my own sanity that was draining away. I went back to researching, but not in old books, but in books of folklore, of legends, of rituals. I needed to find a way to fight the creature, to seal the mirror. I spent days, nights in libraries, in online forums, in esoteric groups, and I found it. The piece, the soul mirror, was an artifact. Not just a mirror. It had been created by a warlock, a sorcerer, who in search of immortality had created the mirror as a prison for souls. It fed on souls, and the warlock, by feeding on them, would become immortal. But the ritual had gone wrong. The creature, the entity, had been freed, and the warlock, in his desperate attempt to trap it, had become its first victim. The diary I had found was the key. It was not just a diary, but a grimoire, a book of magic, of rituals, of spells. The ink smudge was not just a smudge, but a part of the spell that the warlock had tried to use to seal the mirror. The spell had not been completed. I needed blood. Not of an animal, but of a human. The warlock, in his attempt to seal the creature, had used his own blood, the blood of his soul,
to seal the mirror. The spell was a ritual of sacrifice. I needed to sacrifice myself to seal the mirror. I needed to die to save myself.
The idea was so horrendous that it made me nauseous. I didn't want to die. I was not ready to die. But the alternative, that of having my soul sucked out by the creature, that of becoming an empty body, was even more terrifying. I needed to choose between death or death in life, and my choice, as difficult as it was clear. I needed a ritual. I needed the blood of my own soul. I needed to die. But how? I couldn't kill myself. I couldn't sacrifice myself to the entity. I needed a ritual that would seal the creature, that would allow me to die with my soul intact. I went back to reading the diary, now with a new perspective. The ink smudge, the last entry. The diary was not just a grimoire, but a confession. The warlock, before dying, had written about the ritual he had tried to use. He had regretted creating the mirror, regretted becoming a monster, and he, in his last desperate attempt to redeem himself, had tried to seal the creature, using his own blood. The ritual, to be completed, needed a catalyst. It needed a mirror. The mirror, the soul mirror, was the catalyst. I needed blood. I needed a knife. And I needed courage. Courage to do what the warlock had failed to do. Courage to sacrifice myself to save the world from a creature that fed on souls. I went back to my shop. The mirror, covered with the sheet, seemed darker, more menacing. The smell of wet earth and metal more intense. I felt the creature's presence, now closer than ever. It knew what I was about to do, and it was not happy. The mirror's hum became a high-pitched scream, and the voice in my head, the dry, emotionless voice, became a hysterical laugh. It was mocking me. It was laughing at my attempt to get rid of it. It knew I was weak. It knew I would fail. But I didn't care. I was not doing this for myself. I was doing this for the world. I was doing this so no one else would have to go through what I was going through. I grabbed the knife, the same knife I had hesitated to use on the cat, and turned to the mirror.
My hand trembled. My body trembled. I was scared, but my fear now was no longer the fear of the entity, but the fear of failing, the fear of not having the courage to do what was necessary. I remembered my passion for antiques, the love I had for a living past. I remembered my friends, my family, a life I had already lost, and I, in a final act of love, decided to fight. I approached the mirror, looked at my reflection, and saw my face. My face, thin, pale, with deep eyes, staring at me. And behind me, in the reflection, the creature was there. It was smiling, a horrendous smile, its sharp teeth showing. It was watching me, waiting for me to fail. But I would not fail. I turned and looked at myself in the mirror, and the creature, in my reflection, stared at me. I closed my eyes, and I remembered the last entry in the diary, the ink smudge. I needed blood. I needed the blood of my own soul. And I, with the knife in my hand,
was ready to sacrifice myself. The knife in my hand felt heavier than my own life. The cold metal, the dark wooden handle that I had sanded so many times to restore other objects, was now an instrument of death. My death. My hands trembled not with fear, but with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It was the exhaustion of the soul, of a spirit that had been tortured to its last fiber. The mirror, covered with the sheet, seemed to be pulsating, a malignant heart beating in the center of my shop. The entity's voice in my head, which was once a laugh, was now a high-pitched, desperate lament. It knew what I was about to do. It knew that I was not sacrificing myself for it, but to seal it. And this, I realized, terrified it more than anything. Fear, which was its weapon, was now mine.
I approached the mirror, my eyes fixed on the sheet that covered it. Courage didn't come from an epiphany, but from an acceptance. The acceptance that I was dead anyway. The acceptance that my life, as precious as it was no more than a chess piece in a game I couldn't win. I was doing this for the world. I was doing this so that no one else would have to go through what I was going through. The knife in my hand moved. My body now was no longer mine. It was a puppet in the hands of fate. I cut the palm of my hand, a deep cut, and the blood, warm and thick, ran down my hand, dripping onto the wooden floor. The pain, an acute pain, made me take a deep breath, but I didn't stop. I remembered the last entry in the diary, the ink smudge, the blood of my own soul. I took the sheet off the mirror. The creature in front of me was no longer a silhouette. It was a defined shape, a tall, slender man with empty eyes, with his mouth open in a silent scream. But it was not in the mirror. It was behind the mirror, watching me, staring at me. The opaque glow of the glass became an eye, a giant empty eye that watched me. The gargoyles on the frame seemed to have come to life, their empty eyes filled with a red fire, their sharp teeth showing in a grotesque smile. I turned and looked at my reflection. My face, thin, pale, with deep eyes, staring at me. But the creature behind me was no longer there. It was in me. I felt its presence, the weight, the cold, the smell of wet earth and metal. I felt its hunger, its impatience, and I, in a final act of love for myself, turned to the mirror and with my bleeding hand wrote the last entry in the diary, the last ink smudge. The blood on my hand ran down the mirror, and I, with the knife in my other hand, looked at my reflection and prepared for the sacrifice. The pain of my death would be the price of my freedom. The pain of my death would be the price of the world's freedom. I closed my eyes, and I remembered my father, my mother, my friends. I remembered a life I had lost, and I forgave myself for having fallen in love with ghosts. I opened my eyes, and I looked at my reflection, and the creature in me stared at me, and I, with the knife in my hand, prepared for the sacrifice.
The diary ritual was not a ritual of death. It was a ritual of exchange. I needed to sacrifice myself, but not to seal the creature. I needed to sacrifice myself so that my soul would be the bait for the entity. I needed to give my soul to the creature so that it, by feeding on it, would become mortal. And I, by becoming mortal, could kill it. The idea was insane, but the only one that made sense. The warlock, in his desperate attempt to get rid of the creature, had tried to sacrifice himself, but he had failed, and the creature, by feeding on his soul, had become even stronger. I needed to do what he had failed to do. I needed to sacrifice myself, but to become mortal. I looked at myself in the mirror. The creature in me stared at me. The voice in my head now was a lament, a desperate scream. It knew what I was about to do. It knew that I was not sacrificing myself for it, but to become a monster that would kill it. I prepared for the sacrifice. The knife in my hand, the blood in my other hand, the mirror in front of me. I remembered my life, my passion, my friends. I forgave myself for having fallen in love with ghosts. And I, in a final act of love for myself, turned to the mirror, and with the knife in my hand, I sacrificed myself.
The pain of the cut was the only thing I felt. My vision became blurred, and I fell to the floor. My breathing became ragged, and I closed my eyes. I was dying. But my fear now was no longer the fear of the entity, but the fear of having done enough, the fear of having failed. I felt light. The pain, the weight, the cold, the smell of wet earth and metal, everything had disappeared. I opened my eyes, and I saw myself in the mirror. My reflection, thin, pale, with deep eyes, staring at me. But the creature behind me was no longer there. I was free. I was dead. And I felt at peace. The peace I felt didn't last. It didn't last even a second, in fact. It was an illusion, a last gasp of sanity before the abyss swallowed me completely. I opened my eyes, and what I saw was not paradise, nor the nothingness I expected. I saw my shop, but not my real shop. I saw it from inside the mirror. I was my reflection. I was the thin, pale man with deep eyes who had stared at me for weeks. The mirror's frame, with its grotesque gargoyles and weeping angels, was now my cell. The twisted vines that intertwined like serpents were the bars of my prison, the opaque glass, the barrier that separated me from the real world was my skin, and the sunlight, which once came through the window, was now a distant memory, a silent torture. I was trapped. The ritual, the sacrifice, had not killed me to free my soul. It had traded me. I had given my soul to the entity, and it had given me its place. The peace I felt was the peace of a soul that had been consumed, an empty body that no longer felt anything. I was dead, but my consciousness, my mind was alive, trapped. tortured.
The entity, the faceless man, was now free. I saw it. I saw it leave the mirror, materialize in my shop. It was not a silhouette. It was not a shadow. It was a creature with gray skin, with empty eyes, with its mouth open in a horrendous smile. It walked through the shop, touched the furniture, the objects I loved, with its long, thin fingers. It touched the knife, the blood I had shed, and smelled it like an animal smelling its prey. It was free, and I, its creator, its liberator, was trapped. The voice in my head was no longer its, but mine. My despair, my dread, my panic echoed in my mind, but my voice wouldn't come out. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. I tried to cry, but my tears wouldn't fall. I was in a limbo of pure terror, a prisoner in my own skin. The entity, the creature, looked at me. It approached the mirror and stared at me. I saw my reflection, my face, thin, pale, with deep eyes, staring at me. But it wasn't me. It was it. It was the entity that had possessed me, that had devoured me. It was me. And I, in a final act of desperation, screamed, but the sound wouldn't come out. It, now in my body, looked at me, and I swore I saw a smile on its face, a cruel, malicious smile. It moved away from the mirror, and I saw it grab a sheet and cover it. My world, my only window to the world, became darkness, and the voice in my head, my voice, my despair, my dread, my panic echoed in the silence. I am trapped. I am alone. I am dead. But my consciousness, my mind is alive, trapped, tortured. I am the mirror entity, but the entity is not me. I am the reflection, but the reflection is not me. I am the last entry in the diary, the last ink smudge waiting to be erased. I remember my passion for antiques, the love I had for a living past. I remember my father, my mother, my friends. I remember a life I had lost, and I forgive myself for having fallen in love with ghosts.
I am trapped. I am alone. I am dead. But my consciousness, my mind, is alive, trapped, tortured. I am the mirror entity, but the entity is not me. I am the reflection, but the reflection is not me. I am the last entry in the diary, the last ink smudge waiting to be erased. I don't know if anyone will hear this, if anyone will find my account, but if you're watching, if you're hearing my voice, please help me. Don't buy antiques. Don't fall in love with ghosts. Don't look in the mirror. Don't look at your soul. Don't look into the eyes of the entity. It's there, waiting to feed. And when it gets out, It won't get out alone. It will drag your soul with it. If you made it this far, thank you so much for listening to my story. If you liked it, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, and leave a like to help us continue bringing more horror accounts like this. Your help is essential.